Okay, great. Yeah, we can start now. Sorry for the tiny delay. Yes, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining today. My name is Elena Guido, and I am a researcher curating the Korea portfolio at the Leiden Asia Center. And my main focus is the DPRK. So the Leiden Asia Center and Track to Asia jointly organized this webinar to present Joel Witt's new book, Fallout, the Inside Story of America's Failure to Disarm North Korea. The first part of the event will be dedicated to the presentation of the book and its contents, and it will be followed by a Q&A. The total running time of the event will be of an hour, hopefully. I'm joined here today by the author of the book, Joel Witt. Joel is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and founder of 38 North. As a US State Department official, he helped negotiate the 1994 US-DPRK agreed framework and was then in charge of its implementation until he left for government in 2002. He held countless talks with North Korean officials. He also served as a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and as senior fellow at CSIS. Today, we are also joined by Glyn Ford. I hope, yes, okay. By Glyn Ford, he is the founder of Track to Asia, an NGO focusing on forming soft diplomatic channels, including the DPRK. Glyn served as a member of the European Parliament for 25 years, as well as senior researcher fellow in Manchester University and as a visiting professor at Sussex University, the University of Tokyo, and the East-West Center in Hawaii. He will be moderating today's event. Before leaving the floor to Glyn and Joel, I'd like to inform all participants that this webinar will be recorded. The recording may be uploaded to the Leiden Asia Center's official at a later stage. By remaining in the session, you are consenting to the use of the record for archival and or dissemination purposes. And finally, I kindly ask the audience to just keep their mics muted throughout the first session, and then you can turn it on again for the Q&A. That's it for me. I will leave the floor to Glyn and Joel.
I will be extremely brief. This is Joel's show, not mine. I've had the opportunity to read Fallout. It's encyclopedic and granular analysis of the last quarter of a century and more of US DPRK relations. It demonstrates that trying to get yesterday's answers to tomorrow's problems doesn't actually work. It's fundamentally a bilateral story between Pyongyang and Washington, which demonstrates that serial engagement has actually not worked. One could argue that Pyongyang was never going to be its own worst enemy while Washington was around. That may well be the case, but certainly from the Clinton era on, the situation's got worse. From, if you want, furtively reprocessing plutonium, we now have a fully armed nuclear power. So, quite where we go from here, I don't know. I mean, I think the US has missed the red lines for the North Koreans. They're obsessed with a civil nuclear program. They're completely opposed to intrusive inspections, and those are, if you want, two of the reasons why you've had those serial failures. So the US has managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory on a number of occasions. But Joel, over to you.
Thanks, Elena, and thanks, Glenn. I appreciate this opportunity to talk to all of you about my book, but I also want to talk about the future of US-North Korea relations, and indeed the future of North Korea's relations with, the rest of the world. I embarked on this project about 6 years ago because I've been involved in efforts to stop North Korea's nuclear program for over 3 decades. And quite frankly, there are very few Americans who have that hands-on experience. And Glenn, of course, has lots of hands-on experience. But In the United States, there are very few people like that. And quite frankly, when I listen to many of these so-called experts talking about North Korea, the first thing that comes to mind is they probably never even met a North Korean. So I wanted to turn that experience into a book, and a book that tells the tale of why we failed to stop North Korea over all those years. And I didn't want to just write, some generalized academic tone. And I did over 300 interviews for this book. And the result has been, first of all, what I think is the real story of what happened. But secondly, what I try to do is, this is not just a boring book for academics. And it may seem detailed, but what I do is I bring the reader inside the rooms where it happened, to use one of John Bolton's favorite phrases. And I think I succeed doing that in negotiations, in policy making, in calculations about, whether to impose sanctions, about the dangers of war breaking out. All of it is, driven by characters, by people, ranging from leaders to people like me and people like Glenn. So, of course, as I said, the question the book tries to answer is, how did it happen? How did the United States fail to stop North Korea from building an arsenal that today can destroy American cities? And indeed, that's the question Donald Trump asked his aides. He asked foreign leaders. He even asked rock stars like Kid Rock after his only meeting with Barack Obama in 2016. And he won because Trump was shocked by what Obama had said to him, that the threat from North Korea was going to be the biggest challenge he would face during his first term in office. And it was ironic because, at least in my calculation, these are the two men who were most responsible for that threat emerging over their 3 terms in office. Recently, I was reading a post on LinkedIn, and it was an advertisement for someone's book, and I'm not going to say who. It basically said his book was about, the history of how North Korea for 6 decades was determined to be a nuclear weapon state. And I thought, well, that's not right. That's not what the history shows. But that's the dominant narrative that's out there. And my experience, and I'm sure Glenn's experience and other hands-on practitioners is, the reality is very different from that myth. My experience has been that the North Koreans have been serious about denuclearization, starting in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and building better relations with the United States up until, I would say, 2021. And they were serious because of geopolitics. Most people don't realize it, but the North Koreans pay a lot of attention to geopolitics in structuring their foreign policy. And if you recall, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the Soviet Union had collapsed and China was turning to South Korea. And so the North Koreans were looking to the United States to offset those setbacks. If you look at the 3 decades, though, the U.S. missed opportunity after opportunity to move down that diplomatic path. from my perspective, the main reason is very simple. And it explains a lot of other American foreign policy failures, and indeed may be applicable to what's happening today. And that is, we overestimate our ability to achieve objectives which run contrary to other countries who have their own national security interests. We fail to understand what motivates them. And North Korea shouldn't be resolved of all the blame, because switching from confrontation to accommodation wasn't easy for them. And you could see that over and over again during those 3 decades, whether it was their continued pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, I believe, as a hedge for much of that time against the failure of diplomacy, or as part of their own strategy of coercive diplomacy to really focus Washington's attention on dealing with them. So let me start with the Obama administration. You know, Obama is interesting because I don't know if all of you recall, but he started out in the presidential primaries, you know, against Hillary Clinton, calling for summits with foreign leaders, like the leader of North Korea, the leader of Iran, the leader of Cuba, but very quickly switched gears when he took office and, as most of us know, adopted a policy of strategic patience. And basically that was, you know, a standard policy of coercive diplomacy, relying on graduated pressure to convince the North Koreans to negotiate a deal that served American interests. And those were negotiations conducted by diplomats, not by leaders. The problem was, you know, that may have been the strategy, but that's not actually what the administration did over its 8 years. There was very little pressure on North Korea. There were some sanctions, but, you know, most people don't realize that North Korea had decades of experience evading sanctions. So, you know, the impact, there was an impact. I don't want to dismiss them totally, but not enough to make the North Koreans switch gears. And on diplomacy, there was virtually no diplomacy. There was one exception during the first term of the Obama administration, the leap day deal, which collapsed because, in fact, there was never a deal. So I think the administration really made a big mistake negotiating that agreement, or thinking it negotiated. And then in 2 sessions to Pyongyang, after the deal was about to collapse, and when it did collapse, the United States tried to revive the agreement unsuccessfully. So as a result of all these failures, the administration doubled down on patience. And by the end of the second term, or by the beginning of the second term, I should say, one White House official said, "We aren't going to deal with those assholes anymore." And that was the attitude. And Obama himself also started sounding like a neoconservative. He said to his aides, North Korea was not a country, it was a crime family. So unfortunately, while all of this was playing out, Kim Jong-un came onto the scene, and he was very different from his father in terms of how he pursued weapons of mass destruction. He pressed full steam ahead with his programs, and it became so threatening and that Washington realized that this was going to be a big problem. And in 2014, Obama ordered the Pentagon to come up with a plan for preemptive attacks to destroy North Korea's nuclear missile force. But like many of his predecessors who considered military options against North Korea, the Pentagon came back and said this isn't going to work, in part because destroying North Korea's growing force of mobile missiles was very iffy, but also because of geography. And that was that if the US tried it, North Korea would probably launch a war against South Korea and Japan. And on top of that, it could be using nuclear weapons. So that wasn't going to work. And everything came to a head at the end of the Obama administration, when a White House official I talked to said the administration went through 5 stages of grief over its 8 years in dealing with North Korea: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It was ready to resume diplomacy, but time ran out on the Obama administration. So the bottom line was, during Obama's 8 years in office, North Korea's arsenal grew from a handful of nuclear weapons and missiles able to reach Japan to a growing arsenal able to destroy American cities. And so next on the scene was Donald Trump, who realized that this was going to be a big problem. And his approach was right. His approach was, okay, the way to go is summitry, not negotiations between mid-level diplomats that could stretch out for years. And he embarked on this strategy in 2017. A lot of people, of course, remember 2017 for all the exchanges of threats between the United States and North Korea. But underneath the surface, there were secret contacts between diplomats and between intelligence operatives that touched on a summit. So when North Korea ended its testing program, the end of 2017, both countries and South Korea turned very quickly to summitry. And as everyone knows, there were 3 summits between Moon Jae-in and Kim, and 2 between Trump and Kim. I'm not going to run through all the history of every summit, but the point here is, the big point is, summitry was the right way to go, but Donald Trump was the wrong person to be successful at a summit. So let me focus on the Hanoi summit. There was a lot of criticism of Trump beforehand that he was rushing into a summit, that there weren't adequate preparations. And everyone was focused on his exchange of letters with Kim, which Trump described as love letters. And of course, that was Donald Trump. But in fact, before the summit, there was a great deal of preparation, and it happened very quickly. So by the time Trump and Kim met in Hanoi, there was a 10-page draft summit document that basically resolved every issue the United States and North Korea had discussed since the early 1990s. Everything from establishing diplomatic relations to extensive exchanges, people-to-people exchanges that would have probably been run by Ivanka Trump, to starting peace treaty negotiations. There were 2 issues, of course, that weren't resolved, and those were the 2 central issues of the summit. How far would North Korea go to denuclearize, and how many sanctions would be lifted in return? Now, there's a big myth about the summit, which was, Trump was trying to get some comprehensive nuclear deal. Not true. It's not true that he was looking for a comprehensive deal. That was one of the options he went in with, but the summit focused very quickly on a small package deal, the first phase of a phased agreement that eventually could lead to denuclearization. No surprise, the first phase focused on dismantling the Anbyan nuclear facility in return for sanctions lifting. Kim was willing to do that, but he wanted all sanctions lifted. Trump, on the other hand, in return for dismantlement, was only willing to lift some sanctions. Trump tried to convince Kim to dismantle more facilities in return for more sanctions. Kim wouldn't do it, and they're only their first encounter. Kim stuck to his position. That discussion ended, and a frustrated Donald Trump walked out of the meeting and told his aides he was going to walk out of the summit. The problem was that as Trump was gearing up to walk out of the summit, Americans and North Koreans were meeting in a hallway nearby trying to make progress. And they were making progress. They were making progress in defining what would be dismantled, and they were making progress on the summit, the sanctions issues. But as they were making progress, Donald Trump walked by and out the door. And that was the end of the summit. And as everyone knows, the COVID hit, and then Biden took over, and he wasn't interested in negotiations at all. And that was essentially the end of engagement between the United States and North Korea. Although I hasten to add that, yes, Hanoi was a disappointment, but there were bigger factors that resulted in the end of engagement, and one of them was geopolitics. That Kim Jong-un in 2021 decided, because of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the US was a receding power. And he was able to turn to Russia, and China was always there, but Russia and China, who were now at loggerheads with the United States, and that's where their relationship started to grow. So, bottom line here, the failure of engagement has left us in a very bad situation, and everyone who knows Northeast Asia understands what that is. It's the growth of North Korea's nuclear missile arsenal, and the development of other weapons. It's a hostile approach to South Korea. Its view of itself now as a player on the world stage. And then there's an arms race going on in Northeast Asia. So this is a very bad situation, of course. And everyone is thinking, well, gee, maybe Trump can revive his summitry. But, this is very different from 2019. North Korea is very different. Donald Trump is very different. Of course, he's still interested in summitry, but Donald Trump is unleashed in his second term, and I think that becomes more and more obvious to everyone. So, Trump may think he can waltz into a summit and just pick up where he left off, but that's not going to be the case. And it's very possible that this time around, when he'll have no advisors, and he thinks he knows everything there is to know about Kim Jong-un, so he doesn't need any advisors, he will make some serious missteps that will only make the situation in Northeast Asia worse, not better. As for Kim, he's not really seriously interested in it. engagement with the United States the way his grandfather and father and he had been in the past. He has new allies. He has a close relationship, particularly with Russia. He is, on board with their objectives in dealing with the United States. So I could see Kim going into a summit thinking that one of his objectives would be to trip Donald Trump up. There are lots of ways he could do that because, as we all know, Trump is not a big fan of certainly the alliance with South Korea, but alliances in general. So for all of those reasons, it could end up being a worse situation, not a better situation after a summit. I could go into more detail about that, but why don't I stop here, Elena and Glenn, and, I welcome questions, disagreement, and discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation and the detailed accounts of what you told in a book. It was really interesting. And yes, I would open the floor to questions if Glenn has any further note that he wants to make, or if he wants to open with a question.
I mean, I will. I mean, Joel's answered some of my questions already. I was going to ask what he thinks is likely to happen with Donald Trump. I think the Ninth Party Congress indicated some space. I think if somebody walks next time at a summit, it's more likely to be Kim than Trump. So what is likely to happen or what should happen? But I'd also raise the issue, it seems to me one of the things that's been missed is the North's obsession with civil nuclear power. And one of the reasons that Kim wouldn't go further in Hanoi was he wanted to keep a uranium enrichment plant because he wanted to have control of the whole nuclear cycle for his civil nuclear power, because one of the big blockages in North Korea's economy is energy supply, and right or wrong, he thinks that's going to be addressed with a civil nuclear program. So the other point would be, yes, it is entirely a different world, because all of the pro-engagement faction in North Korea, both in the military, the ministries and the party, have all been replaced or re-educated. Some are farming, some have gone through the party school's re-education process, like we. So that faction pushing for engagement is not there. And yes, you're entirely right. Kim's made his choice. There is a new Cold War, and he knows what side he's on. Joe, that's.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I take your point, Glenn, but you talk to many North Koreans, and I understand the point that civil nuclear power has been very important to them in the past, but it didn't really come up in any of the talks I've learned about. It came up during Obama and negotiations leading to the Leap Day deal, but they dropped off it pretty quickly. And during the Trump administration, at least in the talks I know about, really didn't come up in any of the pre-negotiations for Hanoi. And in Hanoi, as I said, they were focused on dismantling all of Beyond. So that would have meant the uranium enrichment plant there. On top of that, Kim, before Hanoi, in August 2018, in a letter to Trump, held out the possibility of dismantling the Nuclear Weapons Institute, which was, Americans thought, Sig Hecker thought, their nuclear weapons lab. And, when Mike Pompeo met Kim the fall of 2018, Kim brought up the possibility of going beyond Hanoi, what Hanoi focused on, which was the Yanbian facilities, to dismantling more. So it may have been underneath the surface. Yes, eventually we would have gotten to the point where they would have said, oh, and by the way, we like the power plants that Quito was trying to build, and we want you to do that again. But it was never really explicitly discussed.
Well, thank you for answering that. And if there are any questions from the audience, please use the raise your hand function. And if you feel comfortable listing your name and organization or showing the activity, you're welcome. You can also not, but that's an option. Let's see if there are no questions. I will take advantage of my position as organizer of this event, and I have two questions. The first one being, within the book, you emphasize how personalities and not just policies shape negotiations, and which individual on either side of the negotiations surprised you the most in terms of, let's say, their influence on the trajectory of talks, or just even personally? This is my first question.
Well, that's a great question, but I'm going to sort of turn it around a little bit, because as most people know who, follow this issue in history, there's another myth out there about John Bolton, and how he somehow single-handedly upended the president's engagement policy. And so one of the things that quickly became apparent to me during interviewing people for this book was, in fact, he had very little influence on the president's policies. Early on, he was cut out of meetings by Trump, Pompeo, and when Beijing came on board, Beijing as well. So he was pushed to the side early on. He tried to make a comeback later on after not paying much attention to what was going on. And so there's this story of how he had one of his aides on the airplane with Trump flying to Hanoi brief the president on Bolton's idea for the Libya approach to North Korea. And I think everyone probably knows what that means. North Korea would give up all its weapons right away and then get some benefits. And Trump listened, and, he took it on board. And he asked other aides, well, what's going on with this? Is Beijing doing his job? And they said, yes, Beijing is doing his job. And Trump knew vaguely about what Beijing and Pompeo had been doing, pulling together a phased denuclearization approach. And then if you read Bolton's book and his account of the Hanoi summit, you could see every time he made a suggestion, Trump shot him down in front of the North Koreans. Not practical. And then finally, at the summit afterwards, the DMZ summit, it became clear Bolton wasn't going to be let into any of the meetings. So instead of going to the summit, the national security advisor got on his own airplane and flew off to Mongolia to meet with the leader of that country. So to me, that's the big story, or one of the big stories here, is that, Bolton's role has been drastically exaggerated.
Well, thank you for answering. And since I don't see raised hands, I will also ask my second question, because why not? It's kind of similar, but it's more regarding the interviews that you made for the book. So you mentioned that you did more than 300 interviews. And I was wondering, was there a particular interview or perspective that you learned from these interviews that fundamentally changed how you understood North Korea's strategic calculations or intentions?
No, there really wasn't. I mean, there were some people who were pretty hard line about North Korea, but I didn't find no one sort of changed my mind about geopolitics, and no one changed my mind about engagement. And, I don't want to seem inflexible, but I didn't parachute in from another planet either. I had been observing events for 30 years. And so I had a framework in which to think about what was going on. And what was interesting was, 300 interviews, a lot of interviews. I know interviewing people, it can be a little bit risky because people's memories aren't always great. But the interviews fit together. It was like a giant crossword puzzle. And they fit together very nicely when I talked to people who were in the room, when I wasn't in the room. And of course, there were people who were hardliners who were trying to spin me, and that didn't work. So, there was no one who changed my perspective. I mean, there was a lot of stuff I learned that I hadn't known that didn't change the perspective, but helped fill in the story.
Thank you for answering that. I see a raised hand, so we will listen to the question first, and then we will see the questions from the chat. That's also an option. If you cannot use your microphone, you can ask a question on the chat. So yes, I will leave the floor to Professor Antonio Fiori.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks. I really hope you can hear me. Thanks a lot, Joel, for the very insightful presentation. I have a bunch of questions, but actually I will limit myself to a couple if I can. The first one is actually related with the Hanoi summit. And, I always remember actually listening to Ryongo, who actually claimed that eventually Kim Jong-un never asked for, the complete lifting of sanctions. Actually, he talked about, 5 of the 11 sets of sanctions that eventually the North Korean leadership wanted to, the United States or the United Nations, if you wish, actually, to be lifted. And we talking about, those sanctions, which, eventually have always had, clear consequences for the people at large. And so I'd like actually to, understand what you think about these. And eventually the second question is a more general one. And, I do really appreciate actually you being, you basically talking about engagement. Actually, I do study inter-Korean relations. I've always been studying inter-Korean relations. By the way, I'm professor at the University of Bologna in Italy. And, actually, sometimes I've been, since my position is a very engaged one, actually sometimes I've always been accused of being, a pro DPRK kind of academic. Okay.
Right.
So I do appreciate actually what you say, but my general question is, and I have not read the book, unfortunately, yet, okay, but actually, do you think, or let me rephrase it, don't you think this is a dead end? I mean, after Iran, actually, North Korea, um, um, you know, basically has no interest at all to, re-engage in any kind of, negotiation with the United States. And, after what has happened between Moscow and Pyongyang, um, you know, um, basically what North Korea is doing nowadays is basically, kind of satisfying, pass me the expression, its interests. And, I don't see actually, first of all, I don't see Trump, and your judgment on Trump is pretty much correct. But actually, I don't see Trump having any kind of interest in talking to North Korea at this very moment. He has other priorities. On the other side, actually, I don't see Kim Jong-un basically going to Trump and eventually kind of pledging him to re-enter into any kind of negotiation. So geopolitics is pretty much important, but actually, I don't see any hopes, at least for next maybe 3-4 years in, revamping any kind of relationship between Washington and Pyongyang. I thank you very much, Joel.
Yeah, those are three interesting and good points. So let me address them. First, on the Hanoi summit, you are absolutely right. It's not clear in the discussion between Trump and Kim whether that level of detail entered into their discussion. The only record we have doesn't have that level of detail. What happened in the hallway discussion is the level of detail started to enter into what each side's position was. So, for example, the Americans wanted to know what did the North Koreans mean by Yanbian? You had to define the facility. They never got an answer until the hallway. And then on the sanctions issue, the North Koreans started to define what they meant by sanctions lifting, including their openness to snapback sanctions. So that's where the detail started. The picture, the brushstroke started on a general picture, but unfortunately it didn't go any further than that. Secondly, yes, inter-Korean relations. I'm gonna plug my book, but it's not just U.S. North Korean. It's also the role of South Korea, and particularly a lot of it is on President Moon and his policies and his summits with Kim. And it was a very interesting. They were very interesting meetings, and I think the accomplishments were very worthwhile. Lastly, I couldn't agree with you more on, are we at a dead end today? I agree. I think it is a dead end. And, I think people who continue to talk about phased denuclearization, okay, well, I'm not sure I really want to be part of that discussion. But the one point that I think I also agree with you on is we're back to geopolitics. And so the issue is, it may be a dead end today, but how do you deal with that? if you think, diplomacy really needs some chance. And the way to do it is through geopolitics. And it's not a route anyone can really take at the moment, which is we need Russia to support some sort of diplomatic initiatives. And of course, China is out there too, but Russia is obviously, I think it's become much more important than China. That's the way to maybe at least find an opening.
Okay, we also have a question from the chat, so I'm going to read it out loud. It's an anonymous question. So related to Pyongyang engagement with USA, I am wondering if other dominant reasons are at play currently and concurrently limiting engagement going forward. Number one, US supporting war with your friends, I guess it's allies, i.e. towards Russia, currently also renewed by war against Iran. And number two, needing clear evidence for Trump to reach out and something to gain from US engagement that is significantly more valuable than what is currently resulting from engagement with Russia and unofficially China as well as others. If so, there will be need to change before engagement between Pyongyang and the USA, and USA will have a chance again. Do you concur with this assessment?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to ask you to read that again. It got a little complicated.
It is a little bit complicated, yes.
All I can say is any U.S. initiative towards North Korea, I think the chances of it making any progress would be enhanced by, some sort of buy-in by Russia and China. And right now, I'm not sure that's not possible, I don't think. So maybe down the road, if Ukraine is resolved, the US and Russia, the relationship starts to improve somewhat. Trump raises North Korea with Putin, and the same thing goes on the China front. Maybe then there can be some sort of opening for some diplomacy, but not for denuclearization. It's going to have to be very limited objectives, like, for example, tension reduction.
So if I understand correctly, basically, the point of the question was if the USA has anything that is to offer to the DPRK that is better than what Russia and China have to offer right now, and your answer would be definitely leave denuclearization out of the question.
Look, right now, I don't see the U.S. having anything to offer North Korea besides, better than Russia. That's for sure.
I do agree with that. I see that Glenn has his hand raised, so please go ahead.
Only if there's nobody else.
I don't see any other hand. I see that the anonymous participant is typing right now, but I don't see anything, so you're clear.
Well, I was just going to make the point that it seems to me that any realistic engagement with Pyongyang by Washington will depend on Washington at least de facto recognizing North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. Without that, they're going to go nowhere. But I mean, the one area where I disagree with you, Joel, a little, is that North Korea has the ability to crash an ICBM on the continental United States. It probably doesn't have the re-entry capacity for ICBM for the weapons to survive, and it doesn't have very much guidance. So I could imagine a circumstance where you have a situation where Kim announces to his people that he doesn't need to test new nuclear weapons or ICBMs, which is essentially a freeze in exchange for something serious from the United States. I don't see the United States delivering, but it seems to me you still have this gray area where it's not clear that if you want, North Korea is capable of a full-throated nuclear attack on the USA. And if it got to that point, then the whole situation would change.
Yeah, Glenn, you're right. I mean, and this debate has gone on for years. Do they have, the technology, the reentry vehicle technology? How reliable are their missiles? And it's a technical debate that will never be resolved. And so,
Hopefully not.
if you come at it from the perspective of a policymaker, of a world leader, of a president of the United States, in 2014, when Obama ordered the Pentagon to come up with a plan for a preemptive strike, the White House said to the Pentagon, basically, we don't care if you think they can do this reliably. We don't care. We have to plan for the possibility. And I think that's the perspective you're going to get from anyone who's president of the United States.
Thank you for that answer. And I don't see any raised hands right now, and I don't see any message in the chat. So I would just go ahead and ask another question. As I mentioned to you earlier, I have a lot. So building on to what we just talked about, this, if we can call it like that, this diplomatic failure that was the DPRK. Based on the decades on the decades of your experience, basically, and on the contents of your book, what do you think is the most undervalued, let's say, risk in the current nuclear landscape?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand that question.
Do you think there is something that policymakers are not really taking enough attention to right now, of course, regarding the DPRK, but even more generally, if you have an idea of that, or some points that during your career you thought this is important and we should take care of this right now, but you didn't really see any type of feedback on it, if there are any?
So I occasionally have conversations with a hedge fund manager in Hong Kong who, spent a lot of time in Korea, and his kids were born in Korea. He's an American. And he made the point, which I think is very valid, that, of course, everyone's paying attention to Iran and Ukraine, but Northeast Asia is one of the few places in the world where there could be a nuclear war. And yet most people aren't paying attention at all to that possibility, except for, people like us. And, that danger, I think, can only increase given the current trajectory we're on, particularly if there's a slow motion nuclearization of the region, not denuclearization. So I think that is very much underappreciated, and certainly in the United States, and I'm sure in Europe too. So it's something that, that we need to pay more attention to.
Well, thank you. And again, building on this, considering the situation that we've been describing, and it looks quite dire, is there anything that gives you hope somehow that diplomacy can still work?
Oh no, it's that question. And I have to apologize to everyone because I've struggled to find something positive about the current situation. And, I did write something months ago laying out a strategy that would give diplomacy a chance. And it was published by the Stimson Center. So, I think step one, if you leave aside who the American president is now, step one is you need to construct an initiative that gets Russian and Chinese buy-in. And hopefully that would nudge North Korea in the right direction. If you can do that, then that may open some doors. Not to denuclearization though, but maybe something like what Glenn is describing, or even something less than that. But I think that's the key here to at least opening the door to diplomacy a little bit.
Thank you. And I think we have a little bit of time for one final question. So we have one in the chat, and it's straight to the point. So in your assessment, will the current USA experience in Iran with a decapitation strategy like advanced USA, sorry, I think I'm not getting it right. Well, in your assessment, will the current USA experience in Iran with a decapitation strategy likely advance USA acceptance of the DPRK as a nuclear state? Why or why not? And this is the question from our anonymous participant.
I'm not quite sure. I'm not drawing the connection here. I mean, the fact that decapitation has somehow worked or not worked, I don't think it's worked. Just because you're killing a few leaders, there are guys ready to step in also. And I'm sure North Korea has a plan for that. If tomorrow Kim Jong-un was somehow killed, there's a plan for a transition. So I'm not sure about the connection.
Sorry, I see some typing again in the chat. There are some examples that the participant drew, and we have a new message now. So if it has not worked, it will likely make the USA realize this is not a quick change and result in nuclear retaliation. I think it's drawing a parallel, between what would happen in the DPRK with the USA experience in Iran, to my understanding.
I'm trying to think of an answer, because I know that there has been talk of decapitation and dealing with North Korea, but quite frankly, I don't think any serious people would think that would work. So I'm sort of at a loss for an answer to that.
Well, thank you for the very straightforward answer. And well, we are at the end of the hour that we had, and I think, at least to me, this conversation was really, really interesting. Thank you for presenting your book and for answering to all the questions, so in such a detailed way. It was really good to have you here. And thank you also to all the participants that joined us today and for the questions that we received. And thank you, Glenn, for moderating the event and opening it up.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
That's great to know.
Thank you and everybody.
That's great. Then I will terminate this webinar right now. You can find the recordings. You will be able to find them at some point on the Late Energy Center website. I will make sure to push the promotion of it, so you will receive an email if you want to rewatch it or suggest it to anyone, and buy Joel's book. It will be a really interesting read if you haven't done it already.
Buy Joel's book.
Yes.
I should have had a copy to hold up, but I'm not a very good salesperson. So.
Well, there you go then. Hopefully now you will have at least 15 more buyings. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.